The air in the haven was thick with tension, starkly contrasting its usual cozy, inviting atmosphere. Mrs. Clara, a loyal patron who had spent years cherishing this restaurant as her haven, stood quietly at the counter. Her presence was met not with the warm smiles and friendly greetings she had grown accustomed to, but with an icy indifference that cut deeper than words. Across from her stood Ethan, a young waiter with a smirk and disdain in his voice, delivering words that would alter the course of the evening and the restaurant's future forever. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. The words echoed in the room, carrying a weight that stung more than the refusal of service. For Mrs. Clara, this wasn't just about a table. It was about dignity, standing firm in the face of prejudice and proving that she deserved to be treated with the respect she had earned. What happened next would expose deep-seated issues and spark a decisive stand for justice, transforming lives and reshaping the legacy of the haven. Before we dive deeper into this gripping tale of courage and transformation, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you're already drawn into this powerful story of resilience and justice, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on more inspiring stories like this one. When Mrs. Clara entered the haven, the restaurant she had cherished for years, a strange unease enveloped her. This place, which had always greeted her with warmth and familiarity, now seemed oddly cold. The soft murmur of diners' conversations, the rhythmic clinking of dishes, and the inviting aroma of freshly prepared meals still filled the air, but something was amiss. Indifferent glances replaced the usual bright smiles of the staff, a stark contrast to the lively welcome she had grown to expect. Bookmark, go back. The haven had been more than just a dining spot for Mrs. Clara. It was a repository of cherished memories. Here, she had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and other moments of quiet reflection. Today was no different. It was her birthday, an exciting day she had anticipated. She had reserved her table just the day before, as she had often done, expecting a familiar evening of joy. But the air felt heavy with an unfamiliar tension. Her eyes scanned the room and landed on a young waiter she hadn't seen before. Standing behind the counter, he barely glanced at her before returning to his notepad. His frown was unmistakable, his demeanor distant, almost dismissive. Brushing off her initial apprehension, Mrs. Clara reasoned that he might simply be tired after a long shift. She approached the counter with her usual grace, her smile polite but unwavering. "Good evening. I have a reservation under the name Clara," she said, calm yet friendly. The waiter, whose name tag read Ethan, looked up briefly. His eyes flickered with something unkind, a mix of irritation and disdain she couldn't quite place. Instead of checking the reservation list, he responded flatly, "There are no tables available." Mrs. Clara frowned slightly, surprised by his abruptness. "I called yesterday and confirmed my reservation," she explained gently. "Would you mind checking again, please?" Ethan sighed loudly, his impatience evident. Without even glancing at the reservation list, he waved her off dismissively. "I said there are no tables available," he repeated, his tone sharper now. "You should try somewhere else." The words hung in the air, cutting through her like a cold wind. This wasn't just about being denied a table. It was about how he looked at her, and how his words carried an unspoken judgment. For a moment, Mrs. Clara felt the sting of memories she had long tried to bury. She had faced this kind of quiet dismissal before, the subtle contempt that gnawed at her dignity. But here, in a place she had come to trust, it felt like a betrayal. Despite the tightening in her chest, she straightened her posture, determined not to let the young man's hostility define the evening. "Perhaps I can wait by the counter until something opens up," she suggested, her voice steady despite the rising tension. Ethan barely glanced at her, his arms crossed over his chest. "There's nothing for you here," he said with a smirk, his voice laced with mockery. "You should leave." The words stung, sharper and more profound than she expected. "Nothing for you here." They echoed a sentiment she had heard too many times before, words that carried a weight far heavier than their surface meaning. Mrs. Clara looked around the restaurant. She noticed a few diners casting uneasy glances in her direction, some quickly looking away when their eyes met hers. She recognized a feeling of a mix of discomfort and silent complicity. This was not the evening she had envisioned. But walking away wasn't an option. Not this time. Mrs. Clara had spent a lifetime weathering storms of prejudice and quiet indignities. She had learned long ago that dignity wasn't something to be handed out by others. It was something you held on to, even when the world tried to take it away. "Perhaps you don't realize who I am," she said quietly, her voice measured but firm. She wasn't one to flaunt her connections, but the thought that this young man could treat anyone this way, even if she weren't who she was, filled her with the resolve to stand her ground. Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't care who you are," he replied, his smirk widening. "There's no place for people like you here." The room seemed to shrink as his words hit her, their venom unmistakable. "People like you." It wasn't just the denial of a table, it was the weight of history that those words dragged with them. For a brief moment, Mrs. Clara felt herself falter, the quiet endurance of years threatening to overwhelm her. But instead of retreating, she found herself standing taller. This young man didn't know who he was speaking to, and for now, she wouldn't reveal it. Not yet. She wanted to see how far he would go and how deep his disdain ran. With a quiet determination, Mrs. Clara decided that she would not be pushed out from a place that once felt like home. She wasn't just fighting for a table or a reservation, she was standing against something much more extensive, older and darker. "May I speak to the manager?" she asked softly but firmly, her tone leaving no room for dismissal. The smirk on Ethan's face didn't waver. If anything, it grew colder, more pointed. "There's no need for that," he said, his voice filled with the arrogance of someone who thought he held all the power in the situation. But Mrs. Clara knew better. She had faced far more significant challenges in her life than a dismissive waiter. If Ethan thought she would quietly fade away, he was sorely mistaken. With her hands steady and her resolve unwavering, Mrs. Clara stood her ground, knowing that this battle wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Ethan's smirk lingered as he crossed his arms, radiating a sense of authority that was as misplaced as infuriating. Mrs. Clara stood firm, but her request to see the manager was met with visible disdain. "There's no point," he said dismissively, his tone edged with mockery. "The manager isn't going to make a table appear out of thin air." Despite his attempt to undermine her, Mrs. Clara refused to back down. "I'm willing to wait," she replied calmly, her voice steady and unwavering. Her request wasn't unreasonable, it was a simple appeal of basic courtesy. But Ethan's arrogance only deepened. "I told you," he said, leaning forward slightly, lowering his voice in a conspiratorial tone that dripped with condescension. "You don't belong here. Why don't you go somewhere more suitable?" His eyes swept over her worn coat and modest shoes, his meaning painfully clear. For a moment, the weight of his words pressed heavily on Mrs. Clara. It wasn't just about being denied a table. It was about being denied dignity, about being told yet again that she wasn't enough. Her mind flickered to memories she had long tried to forget. Moments as a child when she and her mother were turned away from stores, the quiet humiliation of being told to leave spaces deemed too refined for someone like her. But this was different. This wasn't just another painful memory to carry silently. This was her moment to push back. She drew a deep breath, steadied herself, and looked at Ethan directly. "I'm not asking for anything more than what I reserved available," she said, her tone calm but unwavering. "If you don't check, I'd like to speak to someone who will." Ethan's expression hardened, the smirk replaced by a cold sneer. "You're wasting everyone's time," he said, his voice rising slightly, loud enough for nearby diners to hear. Mrs. Clara glanced around, noticing how the other patrons were now openly watching the exchange. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats or glancing away when her eyes met theirs. Others seemed more curious, their gazes fixed on the unfolding confrontation. The tension in the room was palpable, but Mrs. Clara wasn't about to let herself be pushed out of a space she had every right to occupy. "I'm not leaving," she said simply, her voice carrying a quiet strength that made Ethan falter, if only for a moment. His smirk returned, though it seemed more forced now. "Fine," he said, throwing his hands up in mock surrender. "I'll get the manager, but don't expect anything to change." Ethan disappeared through a doorway, leaving Mrs. Clara alone at the counter. The murmurs in the restaurant grew louder, a mix of curiosity and judgment hanging in the air. Mrs. Clara ignored them, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of her breathing, grounding herself in the knowledge that she was in the right. When the manager, Mr. Thomas, finally appeared, his expression was one of polite detachment. He approached with measured steps, clearly prepared to handle what he likely assumed was a minor inconvenience. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm but professional. "I understand there's been some confusion with your reservation." Mrs. Clara met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "Not confusion," she corrected. "Disrespect. I called yesterday and confirmed my table, but your employee refused to check and asked me to leave." Mr. Thomas's eyes flicked toward Ethan, who had returned to the counter with an air of smug satisfaction. The manager's brow furrowed slightly, and he turned back to Mrs. Clara. "I apologize for any misunderstanding," he said quickly. "Let me find you a table right away." But Mrs. Clara wasn't satisfied with a quick fix. "This isn't just about a table," she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge of determination. "It's about how I was treated when I walked through that door. Your employee didn't just dismiss my reservation, he dismissed me." Mr. Thomas hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. The eyes of the other diners were now firmly on him, their whispers growing louder. "I assure you," he said, his tone slipping into one of forced politeness, "we value all of our customers here at the Haven." Mrs. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the manager's rehearsed platitudes. "Because that's not the message your staff is sending." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance starting to waver. Mr. Thomas glanced at him, his frown deepening. "I'll handle this," the manager said quickly, his voice low as if trying to diffuse the situation without drawing further attention. But it was too late. The moment had already captured the room's attention, and phones were discreetly pointed toward the interaction. Mrs. Clara noticed but didn't flinch. She wasn't here for a spectacle, but she wouldn't shy away. She wouldn't shy away if I'm not looking for an apology that comes only because people are watching, Mrs. Clara continued, her voice calm but filled with quiet authority. "I'm looking for accountability, assurance that this won't happen to me or anyone else again." The manager's expression tightened, and he nodded quickly. "Of course. I'll address this with the staff immediately," he said, his words rushed as though eager to move past the moment. Mrs. Clara oversaw him, sensing his discomfort and reluctance to engage with the deeper issue. "I'll hold you to that," she said simply, her tone leaving no room for dismissal. Ethan, now visibly nervous, avoided her gaze. The earlier confidence he had flaunted was gone, replaced by the creeping realization that this situation wouldn't fade quietly into the background. Mrs. Clara stayed at the counter, her presence calm yet commanding. She wasn't here to create a scene or seek revenge. She was here to stand her ground and ensure that the dignity she had fought for her entire life wasn't easily dismissed. As the confrontation at the restaurant continued, a ripple effect began taking shape outside the Haven's walls. Among the many diners present, one discreetly recorded the unfolding exchange between Mrs. Clara, the dismissive waiter Ethan, and the hesitant manager Mr. Thomas. Within minutes, the video was uploaded to social media with a caption that quickly caught attention. "Elderly woman disrespected at a local restaurant. Is this what we've come to?" Miles away, Lucas, the owner of the Haven and Mrs. Clara's son, was scrolling through his phone when the post appeared in his feed. At first, the caption seemed like just another news story, a distant injustice that evoked frustration but felt outside his immediate control. But as he pressed play, his blood ran cold. His mother stood tall but visibly hurt on the screen, facing an infuriating and painfully familiar situation. Lucas watched in disbelief as Ethan's smugness radiated through the screen, and the young man's dismissive tones starkly contrasted with the reality she had arrived. The manager's attempt to appease her only deepened Lucas's anger, as it became clear that no one had taken the time to recognize who she was, and more importantly, the values the Haven was supposed to uphold. Lucas had always envisioned the Haven, where people from all walks of life could feel welcome. For years, he had poured his heart into building a business and a sanctuary space that reflected the respect and warmth his mother had instilled in him growing up. Seeing that vision crumble, especially with Mrs. Clara at the center of it, ignited a fury in him that he hadn't felt in years. Lucas grabbed his car keys and headed straight for the restaurant without hesitation. The drive was a blur of emotions, anger, shame, and determination swirling within him. Questions pounded in his head. How could this have happened? What kind of culture had allowed such behavior to flourish under his leadership? As Lucas approached the Haven, seeing the restaurant he had built from the ground up only deepened his resolve. This was his domain, his creation, and he wouldn't let it be tarnished by arrogance and prejudice. When Lucas pushed open the front doors, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath collectively. Conversations hushed and all eyes turned toward him. His sudden arrival only heightened the tension for sudden arrival. For others, the quiet authority with which he entered signaled that this wasn't just another diner stepping in for a meal. Lucas's gaze immediately found his mother standing near the counter with her back straight, her hands steady, despite the hostility she had endured. Nearby, Ethan and Mr. Thomas stood awkwardly, their postures stiff as they registered who had just entered the room. Ethan's face turned pale as realization dawned. No ordinary customer was walking through the door, and this was the son of the woman he had disrespected so blatantly. Lucas didn't stop to exchange pleasantries. His focus was razor-sharp, and his calm voice carried an unmistakable edge of authority. "What happened here?" he asked, addressing no one in particular, but making it clear he expected answers. Mr. Thomas, visibly flustered, tried to step forward, his words tumbling out in an attempt to explain. "There seems to have been some confusion about a reservation." But Lucas cut him off with a sharp glance. "I'm not asking about confusion," he said, his tone as cold as steel. "I'm asking why my mother," he emphasized the word deliberately, letting its weight settle in the air, was treated with such disrespect in her son's restaurant. The room was silent now, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Ethan looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, his earlier smugness wholly evaporated, his mouth opened as though to respond, but no words came out. Lucas's eyes locked onto Ethan, and his voice dropped, quiet but filled with unyielding authority. "You're fired," he said, each word cutting through the air like a blade. The declaration hung in the air, and for a moment, Ethan looked like he might argue. But the look in Lucas's eyes left no room for negotiation. With his head hanging low, Ethan gathered his things and walked out, the sound of his footsteps heavy with realizing what he had just lost. Turning back to Mr. Thomas, Lucas's expression softened slightly, but still carried the weight of his disappointment. "And you," he began, his voice firm but less cutting, "were trusted to uphold the values of this restaurant in my absence. That trust was misplaced." Mr. Thomas swallowed hard, nodding quickly as he stammered an apology. "I'm so sorry, Lucas. I didn't realize." "This isn't about not realizing," Lucas interrupted. "This is about failing to uphold the principles this place stands for." The Haven was built to be a place of respect, inclusivity, and community. And today, those values were trampled. The diners watching in stunned silence now exchanged glances, their earlier whispers replaced by a collective sense of recognition. This was no ordinary confrontation. This was a reckoning. Lucas took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. Addressing the diners directly, he raised his voice so everyone could hear. "What happened today was wrong," he said, his tone sincere but commanding. "No one, whether a regular customer or walking in for the first time, should ever be made to feel like they don't belong. Not here. Not anywhere." His words resonated, drawing quiet nods of agreement from many in the room. Some diners had already begun recording, their phones capturing the moment as Lucas stood tall, addressing the immediate issue and the enormous injustice it represented. Turning back to Mrs. Clara, Lucas approached her with gentleness, contrasting sharply with his earlier anger. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said softly, his voice filled with genuine regret. "You deserved better than this." Mrs. Clara gave him a small, knowing smile. "You did the right thing," she said simply, her voice calm, but carrying a warmth that reassured him. Together, they stood in the center of the restaurant, a symbol of what it meant to fight for justice, not just for themselves, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. As Ethan slinked out of the restaurant, his presence was replaced by a silence that seemed to echo in the room, and Lucas turned his attention back to the staff and patrons. The air was heavy, not with anger, but with the unspoken truth that what had happened wasn't merely a misunderstanding. It was a symptom of something deeper, something systemic that Lucas couldn't ignore. The diners, many of whom had been quietly watching, now murmured among themselves. The hum of their whispers carried a mixture of awe and tension. A few still had their phones discreetly pointed toward Lucas, recording his every word and movement. But Lucas wasn't concerned with the cameras or the spectacle. He focused on ensuring that justice and accountability took center stage. The manager, Mr. Thomas, remained rooted near the counter, visibly shaken by the events. He seemed unsure whether to stay silent or attempt to defend himself. Lucas took a deep breath, his gaze softening slightly as he addressed the man he had trusted to oversee the haven in his absence. "This isn't just about what happened to my mother," Lucas began, his voice calm but firm. "It's about what this place stands for. It's always stood for. Respect, inclusivity, community. These aren't just words we use to attract customers. They're the foundation of everything we do here." Mr. Thomas nodded quickly, his hands clasped before him as if trying to shield himself from the weight of Lucas's words. "I understand," he stammered. "This was an isolated incident, I assure you." Lucas held up a hand to stop him. "No," he said sharply. "This wasn't isolated, and we both know that." The tension in the room thickened as Lucas's words sank in. He wasn't just addressing the immediate offense. He was holding up a mirror to the biases and prejudices that had managed to seep into the very fabric of a place he had built to be different. Turning back to the diners, Lucas raised his voice slightly, ensuring everyone could hear. "What happened today is a reflection of a larger problem," he said, his words measured but powerful. "And it's a problem we must address not just here in this restaurant, but everywhere." Mrs. Clara watched her son with quiet pride, her hands clasped loosely before her. She had always known Lucas was capable of great things, but seeing him take this painful moment and transform it into an opportunity for growth filled her with a deep sense of fulfillment. Lucas returned his attention to Mr. Thomas, his expression softening just slightly. "I trusted you to uphold the values of this place," he said, "and I believe you can do better. But trust isn't unconditional. It has to be earned, and today we all have work to do to earn back the trust that's been broken." Mr. Thomas nodded solemnly, the weight of Lucas's words visibly sinking in. "I'll do better," he promised, his voice low but sincere. "I'll make sure this never happens again." Lucas gave him a slight nod of acknowledgement before addressing the room again. "To everyone here, I want to apologize not just for what happened to my mother, but for the fact that it happened at all. This isn't the kind of place we run, and it's not the place I'll ever allow it to become." The room remained silent for a moment, the gravity of Lucas's words resonating with everyone present. Then slowly, a ripple of applause began to spread. It wasn't the loud, boisterous applause that celebrated a victory, but a quieter, more thoughtful acknowledgement of what Lucas had just done. As the applause faded, Lucas turned to his mother. The fury and determination that had fueled him earlier had softened into something more, Tenderon's love and respect for the woman who had shaped him. "Mom," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "You taught me everything about standing up for what's right. I'm sorry it took me to show you that I learned." Mrs. Clara smiled warmly, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "You showed me plenty today," she said gently, "and you showed everyone here too." Lucas squeezed her hand, returning to the patrons and staff. "We're going to make changes," he said firmly, his voice regaining its authoritative edge. "Starting immediately. Sensitivity training for every employee, a thorough review of how we operate, and a commitment I'm making to all of you that something like this will never happen again." The staff members exchanged glances, a mix of relief and determination in their expressions. They had seen Lucas's leadership before, but never quite like this. His words carried a conviction that left no room for doubt. Change was coming, and it wasn't optional. The diners, too, seemed to sense the significance of what was happening. This wasn't just about a single incident or a single restaurant. It was about the kind of world they wanted to live, where dignity and respect weren't just ideals but everyday practices. As Lucas finished speaking, a few patrons approached Mrs. Clara, offering her quiet words of support and admiration. She accepted them graciously, her composure unshaken even after everything she had endured. One woman, a younger diner with tears, paused to address Mrs. Clara and Lucas. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice trembling slightly, "for standing up, for saying what needed to be said. It means more than you know." Mrs. Clara gave her a warm smile. "It means a lot to me too," she replied softly. As the woman returned to her seat, Lucas looked around the room one final time. "This isn't the end," he said firmly. "It's the beginning of something better. And I promise we'll get there together." The weight of his words hung in the air, a powerful reminder that even in moments of pain and injustice, there was room for growth, change, and hope. The fallout from the incident at the Haven was swift and far-reaching. By the time Lucas returned to his office later that evening, the video of the confrontation had gone viral. Captured by a customer dining during the event, the clip now had thousands of shares and comments. The caption read, "Restaurant owner confronts discrimination against his mother. Justice served." As Lucas scrolled through the comments, the sheer volume of reactions overwhelmed him. Some expressed outrage at how Mrs. Clara was treated, while others praised Lucas for his decisive actions. Many shared their stories of facing prejudice, turning the post into a platform for collective reflection. "Thank you for standing up for your mother and all of us who've experienced this kind of treatment," one commenter wrote. "This is how change happens," another added. By calling out injustice when we see it, Lucas couldn't ignore the flood of emotions from reading these messages. He had acted instinctively in the heat of the moment, driven by his love for his mother and his commitment to his restaurant's values. But now, it was clear that what had happened at the Haven had resonated far beyond its walls. The following day, the phone at the Haven rang non-stop. Journalists from local and national news outlets were calling, eager to cover the story. Customers, both regulars and new faces, stopped by to offer their support. Some came with flowers for Mrs. Clara, while others simply wanted to express gratitude for Lucas's stand. For Mrs. Clara, the attention was both heartening and humbling. She had never sought the spotlight, but she understood the power of her experience being shared so widely. Each story she heard from others who had faced similar struggles reinforced her belief that standing up was the right choice. No matter how difficult it had been. "I've lived through moments like this all my life," Mrs. Clara confided to Lucas as they sat together in the restaurant's quieter hours. "But this time feels different. This time, it feels like people are listening." Lucas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's more than just listening, Mom," he said. "It's about showing that we can't let moments like this pass by unnoticed. If we don't take action, nothing changes." As the days went on, the video continued to gain traction. Social media users shared it with hashtags like Stand Up for Justice and Inclusion Matters, amplifying its reach. Celebrities, community leaders, and activists weighed in, commending Lucas's actions and calling for broader discussions about workplace culture, implicit bias, and systemic discrimination. The restaurant, once just a cozy neighborhood favorite, had now become a symbol of resilience and accountability. But Lucas knew that symbolic gestures alone wouldn't be enough. It was time to translate the energy of the moment into meaningful change. One of Lucas's first steps was to announce a comprehensive plan to address the issues exposed by the incident. He met with his entire staff, laying out his vision for the Haven moving forward. "We're not just going to move on from this like it never happened," Lucas said, his tone severe but hopeful. "We're going to learn from it. We're going to grow." The plan included several key initiatives: mandatory sensitivity and diversity training. Every employee, from kitchen staff to management, would participate in workshops designed to raise awareness about unconscious biases and teach practical strategies for fostering inclusivity. Anonymous reporting system. Lucas introduced a confidential way for employees and customers to report any instances of discrimination or misconduct. "No one should ever feel silenced," he explained. Community partnerships. Lucas contacted local organizations focused on social justice and equality, inviting them to collaborate to create a more inclusive environment at the Haven. These changes were met with enthusiasm and apprehension from the staff. For some, it was an opportunity to reflect and grow. For others, it felt like a challenge to the status quo. But Lucas clarified that these steps weren't optional. they were essential. "This isn't just about one incident," he said during the meeting. "It's about ensuring that the Haven truly lives up to its name, a place where everyone feels welcome." The response from the community was overwhelming. Local leaders praised Lucas for his proactive approach, commending him for not shying away from the hard conversations the situation demanded. Customers flooded the restaurant with support, leaving notes of encouragement for Mrs. Clara and the staff. One note, written in neat cursive on a small card, read, "Dear Mrs. Clara, your strength reminds us that change starts with individuals who refuse to be silenced. Thank you for inspiring us all." Another simply said, "Thank you for reminding us that standing up matters." Mrs. Clara read each note carefully, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had always believed in the quiet strength of resilience, but now she saw how her story had touched so many lives. Lucas also received messages from other restaurant owners inspired by his response. Some asked for advice on implementing similar training programs, while others expressed admiration for his leadership. "It's not easy to confront these issues head-on," one owner wrote, "but you've shown us that it's necessary. Thank you for leading by example." Despite the positivity, Lucas knew that the real work was just beginning. Changing a culture couldn't be accomplished overnight, and he was prepared for the challenges ahead. But as he looked around the Havanat, the customers laughing over meals, the staff working together with renewed purpose, and his mother sitting serenely by the window, he felt a sense of hope. "We're not perfect," Lucas admitted during an interview with a local news station, "but we're committed. And that commitment means facing our flaws, learning from them, and doing better daily." The reporter nodded, clearly moved by his sincerity. "It sounds like you're turning this moment into a movement," she said. Lucas smiled faintly. "That's the idea," he replied. The community had indeed noticed, but more importantly, it had rallied around the Haven. The restaurant wasn't just a place to eat anymore. It was a space where people could feel seen, heard, and valued. For Mrs. Clara, that meant everything. "It's not about the apology or even the changes," she told Lucas one evening. "It's about knowing that when people stand together, we can improve things for ourselves and everyone." Lucas nodded, his heart full, as he listened to his mother's wisdom. "You're right, Mom," he said softly. "And this is just the beginning." As the story of the Haven spread across social media, news outlets quickly picked up the narrative, and soon it was the subject of television segments and online opinion pieces. Once a local favorite, known primarily for its warm atmosphere and excellent food, the restaurant had now become a national talking point. Journalists and influencers lauded the swift action Lucas had taken, turning what could have been a quiet scandal into a powerful example of accountability. For many, the story resonated because it wasn't just about an individual act of discrimination, but also about the courage to confront it head-on and the commitment to ensuring lasting change. Lucas found himself fielding interview requests from major networks and publications. While he appreciated the opportunity to share his message, he was cautious not to distract the attention from the actual work. During one of his first interviews, the reporter asked, "What made you act so decisively that day?" Many people might have tried to handle this behind closed doors. Lucas leaned forward, his hands clasped together thoughtfully. "It wasn't a choice," he said firmly. "When you see someone you love being disrespected, someone who's spent their life teaching you about kindness, resilience, and standing up for what's right, don't sit back and let it happen. You act." And this wasn't just about my mother. It was about everyone who's ever walked through our doors expecting respect and fairness and didn't receive it. The clip of his response circulated widely, sparking conversations about leadership and responsibility. Many viewers admired Lucas's openness, but some were skeptical. A few critics accused him of using the incident for publicity, questioning the sincerity of his actions. Lucas addressed this criticism head-on in a follow-up interview. "If being public about this helps others feel empowered to stand up against injustice, then I'm okay with that," he said. "But let me be clear. This isn't about appearances. It's about doing what's right." As the attention around the Haven grew, so did the admiration for Mrs. Clara. Her composed yet firm stance during the confrontation had become a symbol of quiet strength. People from all over the country reached out to share how her story had inspired them. You reminded me of my grandmother. One message read, "She was always strong, even when the world tried to push her down. Thank you for showing us that no one can take away dignity." Mrs. Clara read these messages with a mixture of humility and gratitude. She had never set out to become a symbol of resilience, but she understood why her story had struck such a chord. One day, a young woman entered the Haven and approached Mrs. Clara, sitting by the window enjoying her tea. The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mrs. Clara, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you've inspired me. I've faced situations like what you went through, and I've always stayed silent. Seeing how you stood your ground has given me the courage to do the same." Mrs. Clara smiled warmly, gently patting the woman's hand. "It takes time to find your voice," she said softly, "but once you do, never let anyone silence it again." The attention on the Haven wasn't confined to social media or news headlines. Local businesses and community organizations began contacting Lucas, asking how they could implement similar changes within their spaces. "We've always thought we were inclusive," one local business owner admitted during a meeting with Lucas. "But hearing about what happened at your restaurant made me realize we could do better. Can you help us get started?" Lucas welcomed these conversations, seeing them as an extension of the work he had already begun. He partnered with diversity and inclusion experts to create workshops for the Haven staff and any local business that wanted to participate. "These issues don't stop at our doors," Lucas explained during one of the workshops. "They're everywhere. And we only change that by acknowledging them and taking action together." The workshops were a resounding success, attracting many participants, from business owners and employees to community leaders and activists. Mrs. Clara attended one of the sessions, her quiet presence adding an unspoken gravitas to the proceedings. As Lucas spoke about fostering inclusivity, he glanced at his mother and felt a renewed sense of purpose. Everything he was doing and every step he took reflected the values she had instilled in him. Despite the positive momentum, Lucas knew that the journey wasn't without its challenges. Some staff members resisted the changes, questioning the need for sensitivity training or feeling uneasy about the increased scrutiny. A handful even voiced concerns that the attention might drive away customers who are uncomfortable with the restaurant's new direction. Lucas addressed these concerns during a staff meeting. "I understand that change can be uncomfortable," he said, "but comfort isn't the goal here. Growth is. And if standing up for what's right means losing a few customers, then so be it. I'd rather lose business than compromise our values." His words struck a chord with many of the staff, who began to see the importance of the changes for the restaurant and themselves as individuals. "Working here used to just feel like a job," one server confided to Lucas after the meeting. "But now it feels like we're part of something bigger. Thank you for giving us that." As the weeks passed, Lucas often reflected on how far the Haven had come, not just in the incident's aftermath, but also since its inception. The restaurant had always been a labor of love, a way to honor the values his mother had instilled in him growing up. Now, more than ever, it felt like a testament to her strength and wisdom. One evening, as they closed the restaurant together, Lucas turned to Mrs. Clara. "You know," he said, his voice soft but full of emotion, "none of this would have happened without you. The Haven, these changes are everything because of you." Mrs. Clara looked at him with pride shining in her eyes. "And none of it would have happened without you," she replied gently. "You took what I taught you and made it something bigger. Something that matters." They stood there in the quiet glow of the restaurant, a mother and son united by a shared purpose. The road ahead was still long, but they knew they were walking it together with resilience, courage, and unwavering belief that change was possible. The transformation at the Haven was no longer just about the restaurant. It had become a catalyst for a more significant movement. What had begun as a painful moment for Mrs. Clara was now an opportunity to change within the walls of the Haven and throughout the broader community. The ripple effects became increasingly evident as Lucas implemented new training programs and strengthened his commitment to inclusivity. People from neighboring towns and cities now attended the workshops he had launched in partnership with diversity and inclusion experts. The Haven had become a hub for conversations about equity, fairness, and the power of standing up against injustice. Lucas organized a series of public forums at the Haven to deepen the impact, inviting leaders, activists, and everyday citizens to share their stories and ideas. The forums were structured around open dialogue, with each session focusing on a specific theme, such as combating workplace discrimination or creating safe spaces in public settings. Mrs. Clara attended the first forum as a guest of honor. She was naturally reserved, but understood the importance of sharing her story. When it was her turn to speak, she stood before the crowd with a quiet confidence that captivated the room. Growing up, she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. I was taught to accept certain things as just the way the world was. People looked at you a certain way, and sand poked you, and you were expected to endure it silently. But silence doesn't change anything. She paused, letting her words sink in. What happened here at the Haven wasn't new to me, but this time I decided not to stay silent. And the response from all of you from this community has shown me that change is possible. We just have to be willing to demand it. Her words were met with thunderous applause, the audience rising to their feet in respect and admiration. For many, Mrs. Clara's story was more than inspiring. It was a call to action. Recognizing the importance of involving young people in the conversation, Lucas partnered with local schools and universities to host student workshops. The sessions were designed to teach them about the history and impact of discrimination, while empowering them to advocate for inclusivity in their lives. At one of these workshops, a high school student named Mia shared a story mirrored Mrs. Mirrod's experience. She spoke about being excluded from certain activities at school because of her background, and how it had made her feel invisible. As Mia finished her story, Lucas stepped forward. "Mia, thank you for sharing that," he said, his voice filled with genuine empathy. "What you experienced is something no one should ever go through. And by speaking out, you're already helping to change that, not just for yourself, but for others who might be afraid to share their stories." The workshop ended with the students brainstorming ways to create more inclusive spaces in their schools. Some suggested starting peer support groups, while others proposed awareness campaigns. Lucas encouraged their ideas, reminding them that even small actions could lead to significant change. "You're the future," he said, addressing the room, "and the future can be better because of you." As the movement grew, so did the scrutiny. While many praised Lucas's efforts, some questioned his motives. Some accused him of using the situation for personal or financial gain, claiming that the increased attention had turned the Haven into a publicity machine. Lucas faced these criticisms with the same calm determination that had guided him from the start. "This isn't about profits or publicity," he said in an interview with a national news outlet. "This is about doing what's right, and if the attention helps bring more people into the conversation, I welcome it." Behind the scenes, Lucas remained focused on the work. He expanded the anonymous reporting system at the Haven, ensuring that staff and customers had a safe way to voice concerns. He also began meeting regularly with his employees to discuss their experiences and ideas for improvement. "We're not perfect," he admitted during one meeting, "but every day we can strive to be better." Mrs. Clara reflected on how much had changed as the weeks turned into months. She had always believed in resilience, the quiet strength to endure life's challenges. But this experience had taught her that resilience wasn't just about enduring. It was also about speaking up, about pushing back against the things that weren't right. One evening, as she and Lucas sat together after the restaurant had closed, she shared her thoughts. "I used to think that staying silent was the best way to keep the peace," she said. "But silence doesn't bring peace. It only lets the wrong things grow stronger." Lucas listened intently, his admiration for his mother growing with every word. "You've shown me what real strength looks like, Mom," he said. "And because of you, I know that strength isn't about being Louis, about being steady, even when the world tries to shake you." Mrs. Clara smiled, her heart full. "You've turned that strength into something incredible," she said. "Something that will outlive both of us." The impact of the Haven's transformation was undeniable. Local businesses followed Lucas's lead, implementing diversity initiatives and hosting similar forums. Community leaders praised the efforts as a blueprint for how organizations could address inequality head-on. But for Lucas and Mrs. Clara, the true measure of success wasn't in the accolades or the attention, was in the stories they heard from those their journey had inspired. One evening, a young couple approached him as Lucas locked up the restaurant. "We just wanted to say thank you," the man said. "We've always loved coming here, but now it feels even more special. It feels like a place where we belong." Lucas shook their hands warmly, humbled by their words. "That's all we've ever wanted this place to be," he replied. For Mrs. Clara, the moments of connection were the most meaningful. Every note she received and word from a stranger reminded her that the decision to stand her ground had been worth it. "We may not change the world overnight," she told Lucas one evening. "But if we can make even one corner of it better, then we've done something important." The movement started at the Haven and was no longer just about one restaurant or family. It was about the power of community, accountability, and the belief that change was always possible, even in adversity. As Mrs. Clara and Lucas walked out of the Haven that night, the lights glowing warmly behind them, they knew their journey was far from over. Together, they had built something that would last as a beacon of hope, resilience, and justice. Months had passed since the confrontation at the Haven, but its impact continued to ripple outward. Once a cozy corner known primarily for its delicious meals and warm atmosphere, the restaurant had become a symbol of resilience and justice. What began as a painful moment of discrimination for Mrs. Clara became something more significant, a legacy of standing up against injustice and fostering meaningful change. Walking into the Haven now felt different, but in the best way. The familiar warmth remained, but an undeniable sense of purpose now accompanied it. Staff members moved with renewed confidence, knowing they were part of something bigger than themselves. The conversations among customers often centered on issues of fairness, inclusion, and the power of community. The changes Lucas had implemented were evident in every corner of the restaurant. The sensitivity training sessions had not only improved the staff's interactions with customers, but had also deepened their understanding of one another. Employees who had once worked side by side without truly knowing each other now shared a bond built on mutual respect and empathy. One server, Maria, reflected on the transformation. "Before all of this, I just thought of this as a job," she admitted. "But now it feels like I'm part of something important. It feels like we're making a difference, even in small ways." Customers, too, noticed the shift. Regulars who had supported the Haven for years felt an even deeper connection to the space. At the same time, new patrons came to experience the restaurant that had become a beacon of hope and accountability. The Haven had always been a place for shared stories, celebrations, reunions, and quiet moments of reflection. Now, those stories have extended beyond its walls. Patrons often shared how the restaurant's stand against discrimination inspired them to change their lives. One evening, a man approached Mrs. Clara as she sat by the window, sipping her tea. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Your story gave me the courage to speak up at work when I saw someone unfairly treated. I don't think I would have had the strength to do it without seeing how you stood your ground." Mrs. Clara smiled warmly, reaching out to clasp his hand. "It takes strength to speak up," she said. "But every time we do, we make it a little easier for the next person to do the same." These moments of connection became a regular occurrence at the Haven. From young students to seasoned professionals, people from all walks of life found inspiration in the story of Mrs. Clara and Lucas's unwavering commitment to justice. Despite the progress, Lucas knew much work was still to be done. While the Haven had become a symbol of change, Lucas understood that true transformation required ongoing effort. He often reminded his team that the journey wasn't about achieving perfection, but about committing to continuous improvement. During one staff meeting, Lucas addressed this directly. "What we've built here is a foundation," he said. "But a foundation is only the beginning. It's up to all of us to keep building and pushing for better for ourselves, our customers, and our community." His words resonated deeply with the team, many of whom had grown personally and professionally through the changes at the Haven. They understood that their work wasn't just about the restaurant, but creating a model others could follow. For Mrs. Clara, the months since the incident had been a time of quiet reflection. She often thought back to that day, remembering the sting of Ethan's words and the quiet courage it had taken to stand her ground. But she also thought about the following moments: the overwhelming support from strangers, the powerful leadership of her son, and the sense of pride she felt in seeing the community rally around their cause. One afternoon, as she and Lucas sat together after a busy lunch shift, Mrs. Clara shared her thoughts. "You know, I never imagined that something so painful could lead to something so beautiful," she said softly. Lucas looked at her, his admiration evident in his expression. "You taught me that, Mom," he said. "You always told me that challenges are opportunities in disguise. I just never thought we'd face one like this." Mrs. Clara nodded, her gaze distant for a moment. "It's true," she said, "but it's not the challenge that defines how we respond to it. And you've responded with strength, with integrity. I couldn't be prouder." As the Haven grew, its impact extended far beyond its original mission. Lucas was invited to speak at conferences and events, sharing his lessons about leadership, accountability, and the importance of fostering inclusive spaces. He addressed a packed auditorium of business owners, educators, and community leaders at one such event. "The greatest lesson I've learned through all of this," Lucas said, "is that change doesn't happen by accident. It happens because people choose to stand up, to speak out, and to take action even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable." His words were met with a standing ovation, and his authenticity and conviction moved the audience. For Lucas, these moments weren't about personal recognition, but about spreading a message that he and Mrs. Clara believed in deeply. The Haven's story continued to inspire long after the initial wave of attention faded. Schools incorporated Mrs. Clara's story into their curricula as a teaching tool for discussions about resilience and social justice. Local organizations adopted the Haven's training model, creating programs to address bias and promote equity in their spaces. For Mrs. Clara, the legacy reminded her of the quiet strength that had carried her through a lifetime of challenges. She often thought about the countless moments when she had chosen to endure rather than speak out, and how different the world might be if more people chose to stand their ground. One evening, as she prepared to leave the restaurant, Mrs. Clara paused at the door and took in the familiar sights and sounds around her. The clinking of dishes, the hum of conversation, and the laughter of customers filled the air. But it all felt richer now, imbued with a sense of purpose and possibility. Turning to Lucas, who stood beside her, she said, "This place has always been special, but now it's something more. It's a reminder that we can be better and do better." Lucas nodded, his gaze steady. "And we will, Mom," he said. "Every day, we'll keep working to make this place worthy of the people who walk through our doors." As they stepped outside into the cool evening air, the glow of the Haven's lights cast a warm halo behind them. Together, they had turned a moment of pain into a legacy of hope and a testament to the power of standing up for what was right and creating a future where everyone could feel they belonged. The Haven, once a humble neighborhood restaurant, had become more significant, symbolizing resilience, accountability, and the possibility of change. While the public's attention had shifted to other stories, the legacy of what happened within its walls endured, quietly shaping lives and inspiring others to act with courage and integrity. For Lucas, the journey had been transformative. He had always been passionate about creating a welcoming space, but the events surrounding his mother's experience had deepened his understanding of what that truly meant. Running the Haven was no longer just about serving great food or creating a cozy atmosphere. It was about fostering a culture that reflected his values in every interaction, every decision, and every detail. One evening, after the last customers had left and the staff had gone home, Lucas sat alone in the dining area. The lights were dim, casting soft shadows on the walls, adorned with photos of smiling patrons and events that had defined the Haven over the years. In his hands was a notebook filled with letters and messages from people who had reached out to share how the Haven's story had impacted them. Some messages were from customers who had experienced similar moments of discrimination and found hope in Mrs. Clara's courage. Others came from business owners who had implemented changes in their own establishments, inspired by Lucas's commitment to inclusivity. As he flipped through the pages, one particular letter caught his eye. It was from a young woman named Alana, who had written, "Dear Lucas, your actions reminded me that even one person can make a difference. I've always been afraid to speak up when I see something wrong, but your story gave me the courage to try. Thank you for showing us that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it." Lucas smiled, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and humility. He hadn't set out to lead a movement, but knowing that his actions and his mother's unwavering strength had inspired even one person to make a difference felt deeply meaningful. While Lucas often found himself in the spotlight, Mrs. Clara continued to be the heart of the Haven's story. Her quiet presence in the restaurant became a source of inspiration for patrons and staff alike. She would often sit by the window, sipping her tea and greeting customers with a warm smile. One afternoon, a young couple approached her table, their hands nervously clasped together. "Mrs. Clara," the woman began, her voice trembling slightly, "we just wanted to thank you. Your story has meant so much to us. It reminded us to stand together and support each other, even when it feels like the world is against us." Mrs. Clara reached out, gently patting the woman's hand. "Thank you for sharing that," she said. "The world isn't always kind, but when we stand together, we remind it what kindness looks like." Her words, simple yet profound, left a lasting impression on everyone who spoke with her. She had become more than just a customer or even the mother of the Haven's owners. She was a symbol of strength, grace, and the enduring power of dignity. Lucas had always envisioned the Haven as a community hub, but now that vision was expanding. With the success of the forums and workshops, he began exploring ways to make the restaurant's mission even more impactful. He partnered with local organizations to host monthly community events, ranging from storytelling nights to fundraisers for social justice initiatives. These events brought people together in meaningful ways, fostering connections that extended far beyond the restaurant's walls. One such event, Voices of Resilience, invited individuals from diverse backgrounds to share their personal stories of overcoming adversity. The evening was a resounding success, drawing a packed house and leaving attendees deeply moved. Lucas also launched a scholarship program in Mrs. Clara's name, aimed at supporting students who demonstrated a commitment to equity and inclusion in their schools and communities. The first recipient, a young woman named Jada, tearfully accepted the award during a special dinner held at the Haven. "This scholarship isn't just about me," Jada said, as she addressed the crowd. "It's about all of us creating a world where everyone can be seen, heard, and valued. Thank you, Mrs. Clara, for showing us what that looks like." Mrs. Clara, seated in the front row, wiped a tear from her eye as the audience erupted in applause. Despite all the progress, Lucas and Mrs. Clara understood that their work was far from finished. Challenges would continue to arise, and there would always be more to learn, more to do. But they were committed to the journey, knowing that every small step brought them closer to the future they envisioned. One evening, as they prepared to close up for the night, Lucas turned to his mother. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you'd walked away that day?" he asked. Mrs. Clara considered the question for a moment before shaking her head. "I've thought about it," she admitted, "but I know in my heart that walking away wouldn't have been right. Sometimes standing still is the bravest thing you can do." Lucas nodded, his admiration for his mother growing with every passing moment. "You've taught me so much, Mom," he said. "Not just about strength, but about hope, about believing that we can make things better." Mrs. Clara smiled, her eyes filled with love. "And you've shown me that hope isn't just something we feel, it's something we create, together." As Lucas and Mrs. Clara locked the doors of the Haven for the night, the glow of the restaurant's lights spilled onto the street, a beacon of warmth and welcome. The journey that had begun with pain and injustice had blossomed into a powerful testament to the strength of community, the importance of accountability, and the enduring impact of love and resilience. The Haven was more than a restaurant. Now it was a legacy, a movement, and a promise. As Mrs. Clara and Lucas walked into the cool night air, they knew that their story was far from over. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with possibility, purpose, and the unwavering belief that even in the face of adversity, we can build something beautiful. The story of Mrs. Clara and the Haven is more than just an account of standing up against injustice. It is a testament to the power of resilience, dignity, and the courage to demand respect. Through one simple yet profound act of refusing to walk away, Mrs. Clara reminded us that change begins with individuals who dare to confront what is wrong. Her son Lucas exemplified leadership rooted in values, showing that accountability and decisive action can transform even the most painful situations into opportunities for growth and progress. This narrative teaches us that every voice matters. It shows the importance of speaking up not just for ourselves, but for others, who'll need to gain the strength or the opportunity to do so. It reminds us that we are all responsible for creating spaces where every person feels seen, valued, and respected. The Haven's transformation reflects a larger truth. While we cannot change the past, we can shape the future through our choices. The actions of Mrs. Clara and Lucas have left a legacy not only within the restaurant's walls, but also in the hearts of those who heard their story. They inspire us to believe that even the smallest acts of courage can ripple outward, touching lives and sparking movements for justice and inclusion. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Did it inspire you? If you found the story to be powerful, comment with a 1. If you thought it was truly amazing, comment with a 2. But don't stop there. Share your own stories with us. Have you ever faced a moment when you had to stand up for yourself or someone else? Let us know in the comments below. Your voice could inspire others, just as Mrs. Clara's story has inspired so many. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll never miss another meaningful story like this one. Let's keep these important conversations going and build a community where every voice is heard and valued. Thank you for being part of this journey. We can't wait to hear your stories and see the incredible change we can create together.